All right, so let's jump into this deep dive all about Spring Boot.
Yeah,
I know you're coming to this deep dive already with a foundation in Java.
that's great because Spring Boot really builds on that.
Yeah,
You've probably heard about Spring MVC. It can be a little bit intense for newer
yeah,
developers.
for sure.
There's a lot involved, right, with configuration files and managing all the
It
dependencies.
could feel like you're hitting a wall.
Right, and that can be a real roadblock when you just want to get coding.
Yeah, exactly. You're so excited to start building this like cool web app, and then you hit that wall of like, oh my gosh, I have to figure out all this configuration.
Right, where's the fun part?
Where's the fun part?
And that's the problem that Spring Boot tries to solve.
Okay.
It's like having this assistant that takes care of all that tedious setup for you.
Oh, nice.
So you can just jump right into the fun stuff,
Sure.
writing your logic, creating features.
So less time battling configuration demons and more time actually building
Exactly.
and like that.
So how does it actually work?
Yeah. How does it actually work? What's the secret sauce that makes Spring Boot so easy?
Well, it embraces this idea of convention over configuration.
Okay.
So basically, it assumes that you're going to do things in a standard way.
Right.
And it automatically configures a lot of the underlying components based on those conventions.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like Spring Boot saying, hey, I gotcha. I know what you need, so you just focus on the code that makes your app unique.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I like that. That makes sense. It's almost like one of those meal kit services where they send you like the pre-portioned ingredients
That's a great analogy.
so you can skip the prep work and get straight to cooking.
I like that. So Spring Boot kind of streamlines the whole development process.
Yeah.
And lets you just focus on the code that matters.
Awesome. That makes sense.
So let's say you're building a web app and you need to interact with a database.
Okay.
In traditional Spring projects, setting up the database connection and configuring Hibernate, which is an ORM object relational mapping,
Hmm.
that maps your Java objects to database tables. It can be a real headache.
Yeah.
But with Spring Boot, you just add a few dependencies, specify your database connection details, and Spring Boot handles it all for you.
So wait, all that XML configuration that you used to wrestle with
Yeah.
in Spring MVC projects, like all those bean definitions and Hibernate mappings, that's all gone?
Pretty much.
Right.
Spring Boot relies heavily on annotations,
Okay.
which are these little markers you add to your code to tell Spring Boot what to do.
Gotcha.
So for example, to map a Java class to a database table, you just add the entity annotation.
Nice.
And to define a REST endpoint, you'd use annotations like REST controller or get mapping.
Cool.
It's way more concise and readable than wading through lines of XML.
I can imagine.
It is.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this makes life so much easier for developers, especially those who are just getting started with Spring. But what about running the application itself?
Okay.
I remember struggling with setting up Tomcat in my early Spring MVC days.
The joys of configuring Tomcat. Well, here's another great thing about Spring Boot.
Okay.
It comes with an embedded Tomcat server.
Oh, wow.
So you don't have to install and configure Tomcat separately.
Okay.
It's built right into your Spring Boot application.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Oh.
So I can just package my application as a JR file and run it directly, just
Yeah.
like any other Java program.
Exactly.
No more messing around with deployment descriptors and WAR files.
Nope.
That is so convenient.
Especially when you're just getting started, and you want to test your code or share it with others.
Yeah.
You can literally just hit run in your IDE and your Spring Boot application is ready to go.
Wow. That's awesome. That is seriously impressive.
Yeah.
It sounds like Spring Boot really does simplify the entire web development lifecycle,
Yeah.
from setting up the project to deploying the application.
It does. And another benefit that might not be immediately obvious is that Spring Boot kind of encourages good coding practices because it takes care of so much of that boilerplate configuration.
Yeah.
You're kind of naturally guided towards writing cleaner or more modular code.
Okay. So it's like having a built-in code reviewer
It is.
that gently nudges you in the right direction.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay, let's talk about another buzzword that's everywhere these days,
Oh.
microservices.
Okay.
I know they're a big deal in modern software development, but to be honest, I'm still a bit hazy on what they actually are.
Sure. Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the hype.
Right.
Think of microservices like building blocks for a giant Lego castle.
Okay.
So instead of building one massive structure, you create smaller, self-contained modules that each handle a specific function.
So instead of having one giant application that does everything, you break it down into smaller independent services,
Yes.
each focused on a specific task.
You got it.
Okay.
And the cool thing is that each microservice can be deployed and scaled independently.
Right.
This means you can have different teams working on different microservices
Right.
without stepping on each other's toes. You can also update or replace a single microservice without affecting the rest of the system.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
I'm starting to get the picture. Um, but how does Spring Boot fit into this microservices world?
Okay.
Is it specifically designed for building microservices, or can it be used for other types of applications as well?
Spring Boot is incredibly versatile. You can use it to build anything from simple web applications to complex microservice architectures.
Wow.
Its lightweight nature, embedded servers, and ease of deployment make it a perfect fit for creating microservices.
Okay.
Each microservice can be a self-contained Spring Boot application,
Right.
communicating with other microservices through well-defined interfaces like REST APIs.
So each microservice is like its own little Spring Boot kingdom,
Yeah.
ruling over a specific domain.
Yes.
And they all communicate with each other to keep the larger application running smoothly.
Yes, and Spring Boot provides all the tools you need to build, deploy, and manage these microservices effectively.
Fantastic.
Hmm.
This is all fascinating stuff. But I have to admit, my brain is starting to feel a bit overloaded.
Yeah.
Is there a way to visualize how a typical Spring Boot application is structured?
Absolutely.
Maybe to help us make sense of all these moving parts.
Let's step back and look at the architecture of a typical Spring Boot application.
Hmm.
You can think of it as having distinct layers, each responsible for a specific aspect of the application's functionality.
Okay, that sounds helpful. What are these different layers and how do they interact with each other?
Typically, you'll have a controller layer, which handles incoming requests from users or other systems.
Okay,
This is where you define your REST endpoints
gotcha.
and map them to specific actions.
So the controller is like the front desk of our application,
Perfect analogy.
greeting visitors and directing them to the appropriate department.
Yes. Then you have the service layer,
Okay,
which contains the business logic of your application.
okay.
This is where you perform calculations, validate data, interact with databases, and make decisions.
Gotcha. So the service layer is where the actual work gets done, the behind-the-scenes operation.
Yes. And finally, you have the data access layer, which is responsible for interacting with your databases or other data sources.
Oh.
Spring Boot makes this super easy with Spring Data JPA,
Right.
which provides a streamlined way to access and manipulate data without writing tons of SQL queries.
So the data access layer is like the librarian of our application, fetching and storing information, isn't it?
You got it. And the beauty of this layered architecture is that it keeps things organized and manageable,
Right.
even as your application grows in complexity.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We've got our controllers handling requests, our services doing the heavy lifting, and our data access layer taking care of all the database interactions.
Exactly.
It's like a well-oiled machine
Yes.
where each part has a specific role to play.
And Spring Boot, with its auto configuration and sensible defaults, acts as the conductor,
Yeah.
making sure all these different parts work together harmoniously.
I like it.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, but before we move on, I just want to make sure our listeners know where to go if they want to dive deeper into Spring Boot.
Absolutely.
Any recommendations for resources that can help them get started?
Absolutely. There are tons of great resources out there, but one I highly recommend is the Pragmatic Reviews YouTube channel.
Yes, Pragmatic Reviews is fantastic.
They have a fantastic series on Spring Boot.
They do an amazing job of breaking down complex topics into bite-sized chunks, and their tutorials are incredibly helpful
They are.
for both beginners and more experienced developers. Definitely check them out. In fact, why not head over there right now and subscribe to their channel?
Yeah.
And while you're there, don't forget to hit that like button
Yes.
and leave a comment letting them know what other Spring Boot topics you'd love to see them cover.
Engagement like that really helps creators like Pragmatic Reviews know what kind of content resonates with their audience.
Right. And it's a great way to contribute to the learning community.
Oh, it is.
And connect with other Spring Boot enthusiasts. So we've explored the why behind Spring Boot, its benefits, its approach to simplifying Spring development, and its suitability for microservices. We even kicked under the hood at its architecture.
He did.
But how do we actually build something with Spring Boot?
Oh.
What does the development process look like in practice?
Well, that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Awesome.
Get ready to roll up your sleeves
Right.
and see how Spring Boot can help you build real-world applications,
Okay.
from simple REST APIs to powerful microservices.
I can't wait. See you in part 2, where we'll get our hands dirty with some practical Spring Boot coding.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. I'm so ready to get into some real Spring Boot action. You know, we've talked a lot about the why,
Yes,
but now I want to dive into the how.
exactly. The best way to learn any technology is to see it in action, to actually build something.
For sure.
So let's walk through a simple example, something that you might encounter in an actual project.
Sounds good to me. What kind of application are we going to build?
How about a REST API for managing a simple inventory?
Okay.
Think of like a bookstore. We could create endpoints to add new books, list all the books, find a specific book by its ID, and maybe even update book details.
Okay.
It's pretty standard stuff for web application, but it covers those core CRUD operations. Create, read, update, and delete.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a really good starting point. So we are comfortable with Java.
Yes.
So building a REST API in Spring Boot should feel somewhat familiar, right?
Absolutely.
Like we're not learning a totally new language.
Well, no, you'll see how much of your Java and Spring knowledge carries over.
Okay.
The syntax might be a little different, but the core concepts are the same. Spring Boot just takes care of a lot of that setup for you.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So the first thing we'll do is create a Spring Boot project.
Okay.
And the easiest way to do this is by using Spring Initializer.
Okay.
It's a really handy online tool that generates a basic project structure for you.
I've heard of Spring Initializer. It's like a project template generator that saves you from manually creating all the files and folders.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. You just go to start.testspring.io, select the dependencies you need for your project, and then Spring Initializer generates a zip file with all the necessary code.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So for our bookstore API, what kind of dependencies would we need?
Well, we'll need dependencies like Spring Web for handling HTTP requests and creating those REST endpoints.
Okay.
Spring Data JPA for interacting with our database, and probably an embedded database like H2 just for simplicity.
Okay.
So we don't have to set up a separate database server.
So we're using Spring Web for building the API Spring Data JPA to handle the database stuff, and H2 as our lightweight in-memory database.
Yes.
Okay. What's next after we generate the project? Where do we start writing code?
Once we have the project, we need to create an entity class, which represents a book in our application.
Okay.
And this class will have fields for like the book's title, author, ISBN, and any other relevant information.
Okay. So it's kind of like we're defining a blueprint for how our book data will be structured in the database.
Exactly.
But how does Spring Boot know that this class represents a database entity?
Right. That's where annotations come in.
Okay.
We add the @entity annotation to our book class, and Spring Boot knows that it needs to map this class to a database table.
Gotcha.
We can also use other annotations like @table to specify the table name,
Okay.
and @column to map fields to specific database columns.
Nice. So instead of writing lines of XML configuration, we're just adding these annotations throughout our code, and Spring Boot figures out the rest.
Yeah, it's all very declarative and intuitive.
Okay, I like that. So what about those REST endpoints we talked about?
Yes.
How do we actually create them?
That's where our controller comes in.
Okay.
We create a Java class and annotate it with @REST_controller to let Spring Boot know it's a REST controller.
Right.
And inside this class, we'll define methods for each of our CRUD operations. And we'll use annotations like @getMapping, @postMapping, @putMapping, and @deleteMapping to map these methods to specific HTTP verbs and URL paths.
Okay, so if I want to create a new book, I would have a method annotated with @postMapping
Yes.
that accepts book data, maybe in JSON format.
Exactly.
And saves it to the database.
Yep.
And for retrieving books, I would use a getMapping.
Yes, you got it.
This is starting to click.
And here's where Spring Data JPA really shines.
Okay.
We can inject our book repository into the controller and use its built-in methods like save, find all, find by ID, and delete to interact with the database without writing any SQL queries ourselves.
Wait, so I don't need to write those long, complex SQL queries anymore.
Oh.
How does Spring Data JPA even know how to talk to the database? Is there some kind of magic happening behind the scenes?
It can feel like magic,
Yeah.
but it's actually just clever engineering.
Okay.
Spring Data JPA uses a technique called dynamic proxy generation to create implementations of our repository interfaces at runtime. It analyzes the method names in our interfaces and figures out what kind of database operations we're trying to perform.
Wow. So it's like Spring Data JPA is reading my mind, understanding what I want to do with the database based on the methods I define in my repository interface.
Pretty much. And the beauty of this is that it drastically reduces the amount of boilerplate code we need to write.
Right.
No more tedious DAO implementations cluttering up our project.
That's awesome.
We just define simple interfaces, and Spring Data JPA takes care of the rest.
This is amazing.
Yeah.
So much less code to write.
Yes.
And it all feels so much more concise and readable.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see why Spring Boot is so popular, especially for building REST APIs.
It is. And once you get the hang of these basic building blocks like entities, controllers, and repositories, you can start exploring more advanced features
Right.
like validation exception, handling security,
Cool.
all sorts of other cool stuff that Spring Boot provides.
I feel like we've unlocked a whole new level of productivity.
Yeah.
We can focus on the core logic of our application without getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty details.
Exactly. And that's one of the key takeaways. I want you to remember, Spring Boot empowers you to be more productive and build better software faster.
I like that a lot. This is all so incredibly exciting.
Good.
I can't wait to start building my own Spring Boot applications.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I want to make sure our listeners know where they can go to learn more about Spring Boot.
Yes.
We talked about pragmatic reviews earlier.
Yes.
But are there any other resources that you would recommend?
Pragmatic Reviews is definitely a great starting point.
Yeah.
Their tutorials are clear, concise, and incredibly practical.
Yeah.
They cover a wide range of Spring Boot topics from the basics to more advanced features. I highly recommend subscribing to their channel and exploring their Spring Boot playlist.
Yes. And while you're at it, why not give their videos a thumbs up? Leave a comment and let them know what other Spring Boot topics you'd love to see them cover.
Yeah, engagement is key. The more we interact with creators like Pragmatic Reviews, the more likely they are to create content that meets our needs and interests.
For sure. It's a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely.
All right. I am ready to keep exploring the world of Spring Boot.
Yeah.
What other adventures await us in part 3 of this deep dive?
Well, in part 3, we're going to take things a step further and we'll dive into the world of microservices.
Okay.
We'll explore how to build, deploy, and manage microservices using Spring Boot, and we'll touch on some of the challenges and benefits of this architectural style.
Cool. I can't wait. See you in part 3.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our Spring Boot deep dive.
Yeah.
We've built this really solid foundation, understanding what Spring Boot is all about.
Yes.
And we've even created a simple REST API.
We did.
Now I want to step into this exciting world of microservices.
I'm glad you're excited because this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about microservices being like building blocks?
Yeah.
Well, Spring Boot is that perfect toolkit for assembling those blocks into really powerful, scalable applications.
Okay, so we know that microservices are these small, independent services that each focus on a specific task.
Yes.
And we can build them using Spring Boot.
Yes.
But how do these microservices actually talk to each other?
Okay.
Like, if one microservice needs information from another microservice, how do they communicate?
That's a great question. There are a few different ways that microservices can communicate, but one of the most common approaches is using REST APIs.
Okay.
Remember how we built a REST API for our bookstore in the last part?
Yeah.
Well, we can use those same principles to create APIs that microservices can use to exchange information.
So each microservice can expose its own set of REST endpoints.
Yes.
And other microservices can make HTTP requests to those endpoints to get the data they need. So it's like each microservice has its own little API.
It is. It's all about defining clear contracts between microservices.
Right.
So they know how to interact with each other. And Spring Boot makes it super easy to build these RESTful microservices. You can leverage the same tools and techniques we used before.
Right.
Controllers annotations, Spring Data JPA to create really robust and efficient microservice APIs.
That's awesome.
Mhm.
But in a large application with, dozens or even hundreds of microservices,
Yeah.
things could get a little chaotic, right?
They could.
How do these microservices find each other in like a distributed environment? It's not like they have each other's phone numbers.
Right. That's a very valid concern. In a microservice architecture, services can be dynamically created and destroy their locations. Can change, new services can be added to the system.
Yeah.
That's where service discovery comes in.
Okay.
Imagine like a phone book for microservices,
Right.
where each service registers itself and its location upon startup.
Okay.
Other services can then consult this phone book to find the services they need to talk to.
So it's like this dynamic directory that keeps track of all the microservices in the system,
Yes.
and it automatically updates itself as services, come and go.
It's essential. And Spring Boot provides excellent support for service discovery using tools like Spring Cloud Netflix. Eureka.
Okay.
Eureka acts as a service registry,
Right.
allowing microservices to easily discover and communicate with each other.
So we've got microservices communicating through REST APIs and finding each other using service discovery.
Yes.
What about things like security and monitoring?
Okay.
Do those concepts get more complex in the microservice world?
They do. But Spring Boot has you covered there as well.
Okay.
Spring Security, which we touched on earlier, integrates seamlessly with Spring Boot to provide that authentication and authorization for your microservices.
Right.
You can secure your APIs, control access to specific endpoints, and ensure that only authorized users or services can interact with your system.
So we can use Spring Security to kind of lock down our microservices and protect our data, just like we would in a traditional web application.
Exactly. And for monitoring, Spring Boot provides powerful tools like Spring Boot Actuator
Okay.
and integrations with distributed tracing systems like Zipkin.
Right.
These tools allow you to monitor the health, performance, and behavior of your microservices, track requests as they flow through the system, and identify potential bottlenecks or issues.
It's like having this team of experts constantly monitoring our microservices,
It is.
alerting us if anything goes wrong, and giving us insights into how we can optimize performance.
Okay.
As you gain more experience with Spring Boot, you're going to discover even more powerful features
Yeah.
that can help you build innovative, impactful applications.
I'm very excited for what the future holds.
Keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep building.
Until next time, happy coding.